threat vectors and vulnerabilities. This is intended as a basic introduction to threat vectors and vulnerabilities and how they can be used in cyber threat intelligence. So let's begin with some basic definitions to add to our growing list. What is a threat vector? Simply put, it's a path or a method by which a threat gains access to a victim computer or network. What is a vulnerability? Again, simply put, it's a flaw in a system, and then be that either people, technology, or business logic that the threat can exploit to create an effect on the victim. So we've got some types of vulnerability there that we've got listed. So email, users, remote access portals, software, network, both intra and internet, and host. That's just a fancy word for either a computer or a phone or a tablet or things like that. So these are types of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So for example, people say there's a vulnerability within a piece of software, or there's a vulnerability within a remote access portal. There are more than these. Just Googling types of vulnerabilities will show you a variance within what people consider to be types of vulnerabilities. There's always sort of new ones being added to this list. So you shouldn't see it as an exhausted list, but what you should see it as is a way to think about the business network in a more categorized and structured way. Just by way of a look ahead is, why do this? We're not going to cover it in this section, but I do want to signpost you towards a lot of the thinking behind this and why to do it. And that's this idea of applying security controls to each of these vulnerability types to mitigate or reduce the risk within those areas as well. Again, we'll cover off on risk later on. So what's a security control? It's a countermeasure that companies or organizations implement to detect, prevent, reduce, or counteract security risks. Security controls can be many different types, and we'll come across a few of these later on, but they can be either very complicated or they can be very straightforward. So for example, isolating legacy systems. That's an interesting one. So for example, some systems are so bespoke and so out of date that the only thing that you can really do is isolate them in their own network and just keep them away from the rest of the internet. They can also be things like education and training, so letting people know what type of threats are out there, and they can also be physical as well. So for example, physical security. There are actually many hundreds of security controls out there. This is just to give you a flavour of how the vulnerability types that we're looking at in this section map to security controls that we're going to have a bit more of a look at in later sections. Okay, so let's dive in, and we're going to go through each of these 6 types to give you more of a flavour of how these work. But before we do that, I just want to think a little bit more about the utility of these and how they work within modern CTI practice. So take, for example, all the technology within an organisation. It can be any organisation you want. But if you just have a think about all of that technology put together, that is an organisation's attack surface. It's the bits of that organisation that can potentially be attacked by a cyber attacker. At this point, we're not talking about how likely this is, how viable that is. It's simply that all put together that could be attacked. This can be everything from an organisation's official Twitter feed to the most secure and secret server that it has. That's all within those areas as well. To give you a definition of the attack surface, it's the combined sum of the different points within an organisation the malicious cyber actor can use to mount an attack. People are counted within this as well. That is part of that attack surface as well. Now then, we met the unholy trinity earlier, and again, to use some explicit language, they'll exploit vulnerabilities against that attack service to compromise that organisation. So what you're seeing here is a bit of a definition, development of the language that we're using within cyber threat intelligence. It's not just a hack. A hacker doesn't just hack things. What they do is they exploit vulnerabilities in certain parts of the attack surface of an organisation to do whatever they're going to do. Another way to think about this is as a sort of partnership, if you will, and that's this intersection between threat and vulnerability. The threat is out there, but in order to actually have an effect on the organisation, it has to be able to exploit a vulnerability within the organisation. And I think about it like this joint, they sort of intersect together. This creates this idea of risk. So the risk, the potential, or the probability of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat. And then we introduce this element here of this idea of vulnerability management as well. And this is where sort of threat vectors and thinking in vectors is really the core of that kind of activity. Even before you start thinking about security controls and things like that, you need to segregate that very, very complex technical network down into smaller, more manageable chunks. An interesting point to note about this is I've depicted vulnerability management as being smaller than risk. You can never fully get rid of the risk entirely. You can only reduce it, and we'll do a little bit more on that at the end of this module. So let's jump into the first one, email. I'd hazard a guess and say that if you look across the history of the cyber threat, email is probably the #1 exploited threat vector. We can debate this till the cows come home, but I'm pretty certain it will be email up there. It was challenging for a very long time to find any kind of threat group that hadn't exploited this, that hadn't touched on this. Things have changed with the rise of certain ransomware groups and certain threat actors. They don't use these, but if you look in total, email is almost the first port of call for most threat actors. The question is why? Why is it so popular? 3 reasons really. One, it's extremely inexpensive to mount. So if you think about how many times somebody's tried to exploit this vector on yourself, I get emails every day saying, your password has been compromised, your email account is about to be shut down, we need you to reset. That's just malicious spam email. So it's just been posted out en masse to millions of users, with the idea that maybe 0.001% of those people will actually click on that and be exploited by that. All you need is a computer and an internet connection to perpetrate this type of attack. Also, it's low risk as well. So you can have, because there is so much spam out there, it's often quite difficult to see what is coming from a really trivial actor, so somebody that's just trying to defraud you of your password, to somebody who's really, really, really serious, who's an advanced nation state actor. So therefore, you can have multiple bites of the cherry, if you like. You can have multiple attempts at attacking an organisation. So points to note at this point is don't assume every malicious email contains malware. In fact, there's been a big shift in recent years to actually cite your malware outside of that email, because it will be detected almost instantly by even the most basic kind of malware scanner on an email. Instead, you can embed that link that will download the malware into almost every part of an email. So within the code of an email, in a document attachment, that's a big one, or triggered by a user action. I saw a very interesting study once that was about the success of phishing campaigns, and evidently what this group found in their survey, they did a test survey of trying to launch phishing campaigns, so using spam email, is they actually found the unsubscribe button was much more successful in deploying a payload of malware to a victim than the subscribe button or any other part of the email actually was. In other words, people don't want to be in the emailing list anymore, so they just hammer that. That's a user action. That's something the user's choosing to do that then initiates that the start of that infection. Tactics are linked with this vector as well. So we've spoken about spam. Spam is just trying to send as much sort of rubbish content to as many people as possible, with the idea that maybe a few of them will be gullible enough to click on it. The inverse of spam is this idea of spearfishing. And what this is if you imagine a person on a boat with a spearfish, they're being very, very deliberate about the target that they're picking. This is where you look for very high net worth individuals or very important people within an organisation and direct very well crafted emails at them. So, I've seen things like people will take pictures of that individual at the weekend and then pretend to be a friend and attach this picture and say, look, I saw you at the weekend, nice to see you again, or some other lure like that, and they'll click on the email and the attack will begin from there. Users is another type of threat vector. So people are often viewed as the weakest link within any system. It's really difficult to argue with this at the end of the day. If you look at some organisations in the world, they have upwards of 100,000 plus employees, some even more. With all those people working in so many different roles, the chances of one of them being compromised, it just rises exponentially. So how can people be exploited is in a huge number of ways. But one way to think about how they're exploited is either directly or indirectly. So within a technical concept, we've spoken about the direct targeting, so the spear phishing email, but then there's indirectly as well. So this is a watering hole attack. And what a watering hole attack is based on observation of hunting behaviours of predators in the wild. So if you think about it, there's two ways that if you were hunting some kind of animal, you could hunt that animal down. One, you could go out there and try and capture that animal and spend all your time running around, or you could just simply sit at the water source and wait for them to come to you. The equivalent of this in cybersecurity is, say for example, you're targeting a group within an organisation that has a specific interest. So for example, something around, a certain type of manufacturing or a certain type of code or things like that. And you compromised a forum where you knew that was the only focus. You could simply wait for them to come to you. That's a watering hole attack. Insider threat sits within this category of threat actor as well. And again, insiders can be malicious. They can be, corporate espionage agents who are out to compromise your organisation. But they can also be inadvertent as well. They could be just misguided, or they could simply make a mistake in what they're doing. But they're both of these. Both of these are insider threat. Just anecdotally as well, if you have a look, it's often the users of machines and the idea of a malicious insider that contributes to truly deep cyber attacks. So the real sort of headline grabbing cyber attacks. Not always, but sometimes. Probably the best example I can think of this is the Stuxnet malware. To date, to my knowledge, nobody has ever actually identified an insider within that hack or that compromise. However, the leading analysts around the malware have sort of postulated that there had to be some kind of insider inside the Iranian nuclear program to allow that and facilitate that attack. So yeah, I'm afraid to say people unfortunately are a threat vector within an organisation. If you are interested in reading more, a good book on this is The Art of Deception by Kevin Mitnick, a former hacker turned good guy, who wrote this very interesting book about it, where he purely focuses on things like social engineering and leveraging insiders inside an organisation. Okay, moving on. Virtual private network or remote desktop protocol login compromise or remote access portals as a vector. What these things do is allow certain different types of functionality to users. So this can vary from just gaining access to the corporate network from a home environment to having a little virtual machine pop up on your own desktop environment or a variant thereof. The key thing is, what these allow you to do is for somebody to be away from an office environment but still accessing corporate assets and corporate networks. Within the world of COVID-19, VPN technology has become almost the norm for the entire world. Even if you don't get a pop-up box like the one you're getting on the right-hand side, you'll probably have some kind of VPN technology on your machine. Even if it's just something that passively burrows in, you don't need to log into it or anything like that. It's almost certainly within there as well. There has been a bit of pivot of late of cybercriminals moving towards VPN and RDP logins as an initial infection vector over and above email. So why is because it removes a step. So you don't need to send an email that might or might not have an infection, be taken up by the user. You can simply log into a system as if you were a user. That cuts down a step. It also reduces your footprint, and it means that you're not actually deploying malware in that initial point. You just look like any other user. So you can see, obviously, they're fairly keen to adopt this. Many ransomware attacks these days will make use of this threat vector. And because what they'll log into a machine. So again, they're just looking like a user. So again, cuts down that step, and they can just get to where they want to be, which is stealing data to either ransom it or encrypting files to then demand ransom off the back end of that. Some interesting reading about this is from ZNet, a company that covers cybersecurity issues. And they did an interesting piece on looking at initial access for sale on the Cybercriminal Underground circa 2020. What you can see here is on the far left-hand side is the average price. And that is quite high in my estimation. You usually see them for much lower, $25 kind of at the most. The top 3 accesses that they've seen sold are obviously on the left-hand side, which is 9 Bitcoins, and then following on from those. Bear in mind how much 1 Bitcoin actually costs. That's a really significant sum of money. I'll leave you to Google it up because of the conversion rate, but you can see that people will pay good money for the right accesses into a machine. Chart topping geographies is interesting as well. The United States is usually the top of just about everything, because there's so many endpoints within those areas as well. But it's globally distributed as well. You can get compromised accesses from almost every region in the globe. How do they get them? Information stealing malware is usually a good way to do that, to harvest those credentials just en masse, patch them up and just sell them. Software vulnerability is probably the oldest type of threat vector into the victim network. Looking over the history of computing, software vulnerabilities, or vulns, in my view, are by far the most exploited type of vulnerability, simply because, like email, they've just been around for longest. I mean, you had to have software right to run your hardware, therefore they're sort of the oldest type. Attempts have been made to catalogue software vulnerabilities, so this is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure System, CVEs. And it's a standardized method of recording vulnerabilities. Just Googling CVEs will bring you to many websites such as this. There's nothing malicious about these sites. What they are is they simply give a description of the CVE, they give a description of the vulnerability, and talk how it can be executed. Network. The corporate network, and again, to make a difference between you've got the outside world and then you've got the corporate constructed network. So that's the bit of the network that is part of the corporation, the organisation. It is almost a mandatory target for most attackers who are looking to do something sophisticated, because they need to move through that network to get to the informational asset they want to get to. So take, for example, ransomware. If they compromised just one laptop within an organisation of 100,000 people, the ransom that they will be able to demand is going to be much smaller than if they were able to compromise all of those laptops and the drives, the backup drives as well. So there are some unique elements, technical elements of this. So for example, if you're ever in an office environment ever again and you try and print something, have you wondered why there's a queue off the back? So if your friend tries to print something at the same time as you, that a natural queue forms. That's because it's a type of technology that distributes that one printer to everybody in the network. And that could be targeted by attackers, so they can then start to move through the network. That's a common one. So the scope of network vulnerabilities is really pretty enormous. So you've got hardware issues, firewalls, Wi-Fi access, so guest versus employee access, and then moving between the two. And then this is only being broadened by things like the Internet of Things and bring your own device, that I have called bring your own vulnerability, but that's for the more cynical members of the community. Host. This is a fancy name for something that's not a server, so something that's not a core thing. So this most commonly is a laptop, but equally it's also a mobile phone, an iPad, and not a cup of coffee, I might add. That's not considered host, but certainly devices such as smartphones and things like that would be considered as well. Okay, so that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of the different types of vulnerabilities and attacks, vectors that you commonly see spoken about. I just want to add some additional points to flesh some of these, the usefulness of this out, really. So threat vectors don't exist in isolation. So you don't get threat actors saying, well, today I'm just going to do email within a wider campaign and I'm only going to stick to that. Wouldn't that be convenient? They don't do this. You can see this in huge amounts of examples, but to give you an example, take for example business email compromise. That leverages both remote access portal, well, it can leverage both remote access portal compromise and social engineering elements as well, so the people vector. So in this case, the attacker takes a VPN connection of a legitimate user, they log in, and what they do is they send an email pretending to be that user to a subordinate employee saying, look, I'm the boss. I want to make a payment to this organization. Can you please do that very, very quickly, because we need to do that by the end of the day. The employee then sees that this email has come from somebody else within the organization and more senior to them, and they transfer the money to the attacker. That's extremely simple, but what you can see there is the collision of two vectors, the remote access portal and also the people element as well. Another thing that I do want to slow down on and talk about is this idea that the way that the threat can exploit vulnerabilities is potentially infinite. But the defender's efforts need to be finite because of budget, right? You don't have an infinite number of budget to counteract the threat. There's a very famous phrase where an attacker said, you need to be lucky all the time. We just need to be lucky once. So if you think about all those vectors we spoke about, as a defender, we need to defend all of those, but the attacker only needs to be successful on one of those, potentially, to achieve what they're looking at. Okay, another thing that's becoming a big thing within the security industry, it's been around for years, but hasn't been spoken about to this degree, is this idea of supply chain vulnerabilities. And what a supply chain vulnerability is the compromise of the hardware or software at source that can result in a downstream compromise of a consumer organization. That's quite a complicated way of saying the stuff that you buy and use within your organization could have already been compromised. So if you think about the organization that you work in, chances are you don't build your own laptops, you don't build your own mobile phones, you don't design and build the majority of the software that you're using within that business, right? You just get it given to you, you buy it off the shelf, you do some security to it, but really you're assuming that it's actually secure, that it's safe when you get it, when you buy it. But what if it was compromised before you even bought it? That's the idea of a supply chain compromise, because it's supplying to your business. SolarWinds is probably the biggest example of that at the moment, and that can show you the implications of that as well. Even people can be compromised by the supply chain. So if you Google backdoor jobs, that's a good example of how you can compromise the recruitment pool of people going into an organization before they've even had the first interview. You can get a threat actor leveraging the unique property of backdoor jobs in certain regions to compromise employees before they've even had an interview. Interesting stuff. Okay. So just to conclude on this section, you often hear about this idea of the attack surface, but also reducing the attack surface. So you may say, well, why not just not give people mobile phones? Why not just let them have laptops? Why not do that? Well, it's really because of this kind of idea here. So what you're looking at here is the three factors that you need to think about when you're designing any kind of system, specifically any type of computing system, is you've got to balance these three factors. So security, functionality, and ease of use. To break down functionality and ease of use a little bit more, functionality is simply all the things that it does. So all the functions and all the things. So for example, can you do email? Can you do online banking? Can you, surf the web and stuff like that? Ease of use is how easy it is to use those features, and security is obviously how secure you are using both of those. Now then, here's the thing. This organization here is 100% secure, but it's 100% unfunctional and it's totally unusable. I suspect that computer is turned off, like it's powered down. So you can think about that computer there. Yeah, it's 100% secure to my knowledge, but it's totally useless. In reality, what you find is there's got to be some kind of balance struck between this. So take, for example, my day-to-day web browsing. I really look for functionality. Am I that bothered about what people are looking? If people can see what I'm looking at on the internet, not so much, to be honest. If you really want to look at what I'm looking at on the internet, go ahead. However, when I'm doing my online banking, I have a much higher expectation of security, and because I've got a higher expectation of security, I'm prepared to compromise on how easy that service is to use through security controls such as two-factor authentication on my phone. Do you see how that balancing sort of works? Unfortunately, the world in which we live in means that certain factors drive the way that systems are configured within these three variables. So the most obvious case is COVID-19, and the way that has driven businesses sort of globally much more towards the ease of use because of the distributed working. So if we think about those remote access vectors and vulnerabilities, the risk around those has expanded, I would say exponentially, because of the influence of COVID-19. So what can we do? We've talked about the attack surface, and really thinking about things in vectors and clusters is useful because it allows you to divide it down into meaningful ways. And within the wider practice of cybersecurity, you'll often find teams that are responsible for certain sections of that network based on things like, host, for example. One teams are just responsible for laptops within an organization. One team is then just responsible for mobile phones within our organization. One team is then responsible just for remote access portals as well. So for cyber threat intelligence, thinking in this way is useful because it again allows you to elaborate more about the threat in more detail. So for example, certain threat actors have a preference for exploiting RDP logins as the initial part of their intrusion methods. Other actors prefer email. That is in itself very trivial, but even that's more detailed than a hacker hacks. It's more detailed. From the wider practice of cybersecurity, you can see how this becomes more easy to manage. It becomes easier to do budget allocations. What do we prioritize this year? Within COVID, I imagine people are very interested in cybersecurity for remote access, for example.